Duncan, welcome. Thank you so much. Just a little bit by way of introduction. So Duncan is absolutely no stranger to LGBTIQA plus equalities circles and campaigns. And a lot of what we're talking about tonight is going to bring forth details of that. So I'm not going to kind of necessarily go into it, particularly at this moment in time, but obviously Duncan served time in the Navy and has been an incredible and relentless campaigner since being discharged from the Navy in the mid-90s. But on the alongside that has fascinating family history. Again, we might touch on some of that. Is currently is it the director of the Brighton Fringe?
Yes, currently director.
Yeah. So currently director of the Brighton Fringe, has been absolutely instrumental in getting the Ledward Centre, which is Brighton's new LGBTIQA plus kind of community centre. Is that what you're calling it?
Yeah, it's a community centre, but not just a cafe and a restaurant. It's got a large space for performance. We host art. We have lots of events, and adjacent is a square, which, funnily enough, the Fringe runs, which is given free of charge to, and always has been, even before I started at the Fringe, to the Ledward Centre, so we can use it for community events. So, for example, with Pride in Brighton, we set that up as a playground for our families. And because those of you who know Brighton Pride will know it's very big, it's very noisy, it's a bit of a straight invasion now, so the park is no longer that child-friendly. So we wanted to create a nice safe space for our families.
Nice. So you're obviously living in Brighton, but so just like a bit of scene setting. So I mean, this is not your first time wandering into kind of Scottish space or indeed kind of space with the SNP. So you've been up here before, so tell us a bit about that.
I was invited about 4 years ago now to your politics festival. So I talked in one of your Parliament buildings, was also working with the Scottish Parliament Civil Service. I shouldn't call them civil service because, unlike the civil service, they're employed by Parliament. And we were addressing some of the issues that they were having with sexual harassment and equalities generally. And one of the joys of being up there for several days during the festival was actually to have lunch with Nicola, and we actually had salmon for lunch, and I did make crack a joke about that one. So that was a very interesting one, and we discussed what she was planning for our rights.
Fantastic. So a friend to Scotland, as well as a kind of friend and stalwart of the LGBTIQA plus community. So kind of just moving us on a little bit, so your background is absolutely fascinating. And just sort of thinking that in terms of kind of where we're going to go in the conversation, it would be really interesting to kind of understand that background a little bit. And kind of like your journey that kind of like set you on the path towards the Navy, and kind of, what sort of things that you did in kind of preparation for that.
Well, for a start, I grew up on the Isle of Wight, and so I fell in love with the sea. But it was deeper than that. Both my parents were refugees, one from Germany, one from Austria. My father was a political refugee. His father was a satirical journalist, anti-Nazi journalist, who wrote extensively during the 30s. My mother came from a Jewish family, and although not Jewish by religion, was Jewish enough certainly for 98 members of the family to be wiped out, those who didn't escape. And I felt acutely aware of the fact that had it not been for the generosity of the British people, they wouldn't be alive and I wouldn't be alive. Now I recognize, now that I'm a bit older, that actually that struggle to get here, the generosity was not as much as one perhaps would have hoped, but you know, they were given a place and kept safe. So that really informed my life and wanting to join the Navy. Not an easy journey, Ewan, because of course the requirements then for nationality were that both grandparents had to be born in the United Kingdom. So kiss of death for any career, I'm sure. It was Francis Pym, after 18 months of waiting, then Defence Secretary in Margaret Thatcher's government, who finally signed on the dotted line, having acquiesced to the pressure from the first female commanding officer in the Royal Naval Reserve and Royal Navy, Margaret Guy, who was my prospective boss, who had great faith in me. And I can assure you that the pressure from that Margaret would be far greater than any pressure that the other Margaret would have given him.
Francis, like I'm not sure if many people in the room are old enough to remember Francis Pym. I certainly do, and it's a name that dragged out of the darkness of my memory, I have to say. But so you know, your kind of family background, your history was already one that had kind of familial experience of kind of like you know, the outcome of mass hate and mass discrimination. You were in a situation where you kind of really wanted to kind of give back, and the love of the sea that you developed and that desire kind of took you in the direction of the Navy. So I'm just curious about, as you went into the Navy, kind of how aware you were of yourself in terms of your sexuality, how aware you were of the kind of policy of the armed services at that time around homosexuality, and how going into the Navy, how did you kind of reconcile those two things, or was it not something that you kind of particularly thought about as you were going in?
Well, we've got to swing the clock back to 1978 when I first stepped through the recruiting office door. And it was a very different world. People generally were not out, and if they were out, it was within discrete groups. And having been brought up in this relatively small island, one was naturally in the closet. I was aware of my sexuality, though probably like many youngsters didn't fully understand who I was very early on. I think from the age of 5, 6, I reckoned that I was different, but I didn't really understand what that meant until my mid-teens and the freedom of going to college in Birmingham actually was where really I came out of my shell. I thought that the policy was entirely sensible in the armed forces in those days. I'd made the assumption, because women were not serving in the front line, were not serving at sea in those days, that homosexual acts were what were covered by the regulations. And I felt that if you're living in effectively the small metal monastery of a ship, if you had sexual relations with someone else, it was likely to be disruptive. My goodness, you know what a workplace romance can be like for disrupting people. So I thought it was purely conduct-based, and if behavior was inappropriate, then you were in trouble. So I entered the Navy not understanding the regulations, and at interview, no one actually asked me the crucial question because they were far too wound up with I was a bloody foreigner.
Yeah, how dare you? How dare you want to join our Navy, Duncan? That's just how inconsiderate of you. But you, I mean, your career in the Navy was you know, just exemplary. But you saw active duty, and you know, you served, and like, you know, I know a little bit about your story in terms of, you know, your active service in the Falklands, for example. So can you talk us a little bit through sort of your career and your path in the Navy?
Well, I started off as an ordinary sailor. I actually started as a communications specialist, and Margaret Guy, my first commanding officer, wanted to get me promoted. And so I only spent a couple of years as a junior rating before I was swept up into and became an officer and had my brain removed. Margaret was fabulous to work for. I learnt an awful lot from her leadership. And I watched when she was promoted from second in command to captain, how many men who frankly did not deserve the job that she got were acutely jealous, and some of the backstabbing that went on. And I think for me that set a precedent for future, which we'll probably come to a bit later in the story. I was incredibly impressed with the way that she, on the one hand, could be as strong as any man when it came to persuading admirals to make changes, and on the other could turn on her feminine charms and say, "Oh, but Admiral, I'm sure you'd wish this. I'm only wishing the best for all my people," and fluttering her eyelids. So she was a genius to work for. And my goodness, could she drink a nice whiskey? When I joined the Royal Navy proper as an officer, I struggled a bit. I was by then 24, 25 years old. And so I had my own opinions. I'd already served in uniform for 3 or 4 years. I was a bit older than the average, what was then a public school, in effect, the Naval College at Dartmouth. And I would challenge things. It actually appeared in one of my reports a bit later in my life that Lustig-Prean is not afraid to challenge procedures if he thinks they should be changed. And I think I was probably doing that a little bit too early in my career. So I was regarded as a training risk. But I fell on my feet after training in my very first ship as a fully qualified officer, when I first of all found an absolute mess with classified documents. And instead of covering it up, which would have been easier, sort of said, look, I've found this. I think I can trace everything and put it right. It wasn't my mess, I hasten to add, but we sorted it out, and that got a commendation. And then a few months later, well, a few weeks later, Lieutenant Commander on board who ran the logistics department went ill, and I took the ship acting 2 ranks above my own as head of department suddenly through operational sea training, which was 13 weeks of going to war with inspectors behind you, judging your every move. So I got another commendation out of that. And really, as one senior captain said to me when I was in my next appointment, all you have to do to impress is to get out of bed in the morning, because you're going to be sent to places that are in trouble and need a troubleshooter, which is a real gift. So that's how it sort of started.
Mm. And then in terms of, when we've been talking kind of coming into this evening, you were telling me that, it was really only kind of around the time that you were going into kind of officer ranks that you became more fully aware of what the kind of real meaning of the policy was and its implications.
It was absolutely ghastly. I remember it vividly. The mail had arrived on board. I'd been on board the ship 3 days, and one of my roles was to act as not just a watchkeeper, but also the captain's secretary. And I opened up the mail, and there was one big, thick envelope addressed to him. And inside was a police report by the Special Investigation Branch of the Military Police about a 17-year-old sailor on board. And as I read it, I realized it was because he was gay. And I remember feeling quite fearful and as if I was being watched, felt guilty about reading it, disappeared to my cabin with the paperwork and read it. This guy's only crime was that he'd talked to a friend of his in the mess and said, I think I might be gay. And that friend then reported the conversation. He was arrested, questioned for 2 days. I'll give a little health warning here. Some of what I will say about the nature investigations can be quite distressing. The sort of questions that were asked were the most intimate and detailed questions about an individual's personal and sexual life. down to gross detail of what they did in bed. The regulations also then required or allowed medical officers to conduct examinations which were designed to prove whether an individual was lesbian or gay or had committed that sort of sex. And they included internal examinations, which are now classified as torture, including the Dame Danis test, for example, which is completely discredited. So it was, for many people, the consequence of that was years of ongoing poor mental health, as you can imagine from that experience. And it was really that moment of realizing that, my God, this is me, that I went into a closet. My then partner used to come to mess dinners, used to come to cocktail parties occasionally, used to come and join the families waving us off when we'd sail away for months on deployment. But from that moment, all that had to stop, because although we weren't out as a couple, it must have been clear to some people that we were, I was inviting a good friend there. But no, suddenly all that stopped, and I realized I had to live a very different life.
And the other aspect of that is that it wasn't just the case of if it came to light, it was much more active than that, wasn't it?
Yeah, this wasn't some laissez-faire, don't ask, don't tell policy. The military police were really active in trying to find people from our communities. There was, for example, in Southsea, adjacent to Portsmouth, a gay pub just opposite a DSS office, Social Security office. And they had a camera in there trained on the entrance, and pictures would arrive in police headquarters of anyone who looked likely to be service. They would frequently go into lesbian and gay venues in plain clothes to pretend to be punters to see if they could identify anyone. They would take, in cohorts with the civilian police, take note of any cars, for example, in cruising areas. And if they tied up to somebody who was a military person, then they would investigate them further. The investigations were incredibly cruel, as I've said, but one of their purposes was also to see if other people were involved. Now, whereas the profile of the average gay man was that they tended to be incredibly closeted and didn't open up to their colleagues, with the lesbian community, it was very different. They were already a minority in the armed forces. Less than 8% of the armed forces were women in those days. And so they tended to talk to one another in their messes, in their barracks. And therefore, when you had an investigation, the pressure that was placed by this two superior officers questioning some poor young soldier or sailor, invariably names would come out of the hat, and those became witch hunts, which could be reported quite gleefully. I remember a disgusting headline by our friend, the Daily Mail, which there's a naval base in Portsmouth called HMS Dryad, and as you're aware, ships are in HM Dockyard. And the headline after one investigation, which outed some 15 lesbians, was HM Dykeyard Dryad. So that was the sort of tone of the day in terms of the media and the atmosphere in the late 70s, 80s.
So it was, it was really active, it was intrusive, it was persecuting kind of individuals, and that would have a ripple effect out into kind of their circles within their service, with their units, whatever else. So it wasn't just something on a kind of piece of paper on the kind of legislative shelf. It was something that was much more sinister than that.
It was codified in a confidential Defence Council instruction, which was first written in the 60s and still remained in force until the mid-90s, which gave detailed instructions. And some of it to us now might sound funny, like, look for effeminate traits, and that might indicate a gay man. Look for flamboyancy. Look for people who are more theatrical than others. look for hand creams or lubricant, which could be lubricants, for example. It was, or use of makeup even. It was quite incredible, the instructions that were codified. And of course, once the process of investigation was over, you were then dismissed from the service. Some people having their medals cut off their chest as they were dismissed, lost their pensions, no entitlement to the resettlement training so essential for a service leaver. And as a consequence, the organisation that I volunteered with, Rank Outsiders, which we'll talk about later, frequently would come across people who had either considered or in many cases attempted suicide, because they were outed to friends, they were outed to families, they lost their home, they lost their pensions, they lost their economic security, they lost everything in the cruelest of processes.
Yeah, and of course, all of this, you mentioned the Daily Mail, and I think that, you and I, and I'm not dismissing other people's experience of this, because of course there is always kind of like homophobia, biphobia, transphobia that kind of comes out in the press. But, the time that we're talking about here, that this was the same level of vitriol as we have experienced, for example, in the last few weeks in relation to things like the Isla Bryson case. So the context is repeated in our kind of current situation. But
that resonance, that's a very strong point, I think, Ewan, because the resonance of some of the language that's coming out against the trans and non-binary community, who frankly are being degraded by it into nothing more than body parts and genitalia, is so reminiscent of the language that was used in the bad old days, which we thought we'd got rid of. I find that so appalling that we have forgotten lessons and we've forgotten the pain and agony we caused people 45 years ago.
Absolutely. If I can move us on a little bit, because so we've got the grounding of your experience of kind of finding out what this policy really meant, and then there came a point in the mid-90s where the kind of the bubble burst, if I can put it that way, for you. So tell us a little bit about how your story evolved at that point and how you came to a point where you were facing discharge yourself.
Well, I'd had a really good few years, 2 or 3 years leading up to that. I'd actually proposed and worked on women serving in the front line. I'd worked on policies which improved our recruitment, retention, and training of people of colour to try and increase the numbers, because I firmly believe that police and armed forces should reflect the societies they're purporting to defend. So my name was known with ministers, and that fateful evening, I had just returned from London, where the person who is responsible for officer transfers and movements to their next jobs had advised me that I'd been appointed as military assistant to the Prime Minister for my next job. I went back to the ship. My captain and I had a very large gin and to celebrate.
You surprised me, Duncan.
And then the captain's steward came in and said, "Oh, sorry to interrupt you, sir, but could you ring your mother? It's urgent." And this was highly unusual. So I excused myself, rang mum, and she said, "I don't know who this guy is, but he's rung several times, and he said, call him, but not from the ship." And my antenna just clicked that there was only one possibility. I didn't know the name that she gave me, but I knew what the subject was instinctively. So I went out of the dockyard, because we knew that phones in ships and dockyards could be listened into, and I phoned this guy, and he hummed and hawed and said, "I need to talk to you about an investigation." I said, "What investigation? You need to speak to me." He said, "Look, I'm not going halfway around the country to speak to someone I've never met. What is this investigation about? I know what you are." And so he persuaded me to meet him. And at Around about 11 o'clock that night, I drove out of the dockyard, having hidden my partner's letters in my crutch, removed a photograph of him that was secreted in, among other photographs. Nothing I'd say indecent about it either, just in case I was searched. I remember going through the dockyard gates going, oh my God, what happens if I'm stopped and searched? Is this a setup? I drove up to Waterloo Station, parked, and cased the joint just in case it was a setup, using my Northern Ireland counter-terrorism experience to see if there was a police watching. And then at midnight, he appeared at the meeting point at Waterloo Station, and I just walked past him with hardly acknowledging, just said, follow me, because I didn't know if I was being watched in there. And we walked down towards the embankment where he finally caught up with me. It felt like a John le Carré novel. And he said, look, I know you're gay, and if you make it worth my while, I won't say anything about it. And I told him, excuse my language, to fuck off. Before you get anywhere near the military police, I will have reported this myself. And I turned my back and walked away, drove back to the ship. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I was on automatic pilot. It was a Friday, and then we went on weekend leave at 12 o'clock. And over that weekend, I talked to my partner. I was put in contact with rank outsiders. I'd already decided what I had to do because I'd exercised this possibility for many years. I was not prepared to betray the service that I loved, nor my country, and I was going to report this incident. And on the Monday morning, when I came back on board, I telephoned the head of Special Investigation Branch, who'd actually worked for me in a previous job. And I said, Richard, do you think I could come and see you and talk about a problem? Yes, of course, Duncan. Yes, come and have coffee. What time suits you? Could I come and see you when you open at 9? Yes, sure. And I walked in, coffee cups on the table, chocolate biscuits. Have some coffee, mate. How are you, mate? How can I help you? Richard, someone is attempting to blackmail me. Oh, why is that? Why is he trying to blackmail you? Because I'm gay. And you could cut the atmosphere with a knife, and he swept the coffee cups to one side. Are you telling me you're homosexual? Yes, Richard. Well, in that case, you're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say will be taken down as evidence. And I was led into an interview room to begin 2 days of interrogation about my sex life. So that is the sort of beginning of the end, if you like.
Well, and you know, I mean, like, I remember distinctly the first time you told me that story and just being completely horrified. But then, you know, as I've kind of pondered it over the years, I've just thought to myself, you know, how many of us, you know, and appreciating that you would have rehearsed this in your own mind many times, but how many of us would have behaved with that level of integrity? I really don't know that I would have done. You know, I probably would have taken a bit more of a coward's way out and given the guy some money with the risk that he was going to keep coming after me. So, I mean, that's an extraordinary response, but it obviously set you on a conveyor belt that, you know, lasted many years after that. So, you know, tell us a little bit about kind of what it was like going on to that conveyor belt and, you know, your journey forward over the coming years to Europe.
Well, I was suspended and sent on gardening leave while they processed my discharge from the service. And I was giving back to rank outsiders, having been a relatively senior officer and having had so much personnel experience and legal experience in the armed forces. It was useful to rank outsiders who were caring for people in my position for me to be able to give advice and to support the organization. I was still a closeted gay man. I was still uncomfortable being out. And that all changed one October when the police, I happened to be in Exeter, and the police contacted me and said, is there any possibility you can get to Plymouth really quickly? We've got a sailor who's threatening to commit suicide. And this was a youngster of 17. He'd just endured his police interviews. He'd just been outed to his family, and he was on the bridge in the pouring rain in the early hours of the morning, thinking there was no future for him. And I sat with him and persuaded him that there was life after the Royal Navy, and eventually talked him down. And it was really, that was for me the moment on the road to Damascus that I felt that if I was worth the commander's rank, I had to stand up for young people like him and show some leadership and use my voice to change this cruel policy. So I basically became deputy chair and director of campaigns for Rank Outsiders, all volunteers. And then eventually I became chair of Rank Outsiders. We were not officer heavy. We were relatively junior officers where there were officers, and most of the people who were doing the work were ordinary sailors, ordinary soldiers. My vice chair was an army chef. And I think that when we look at what was achieved by a group of ordinary people, well, you know, it's quite interesting. The campaign started. It was on four fronts. We needed to keep welfare at the forefront of everything that we did. And I vowed to the committee that we would never spend a penny of the organisation's limited funds on anything other than welfare of the people who needed it. The campaign was going to cost nothing. The legal action would be separately funded by the help of Stonewall and lawyers who were working pro bono. We needed to fight a battle in the courts, we knew that. We needed to change hearts and minds in the public. We needed to fight a battle in the media. And then we had to have a parliamentary battle as well. And that is where it all really kicked off, and really didn't, from October, November 1994, it was not out of the press until January 2000.
So you had 6 years of being in the spotlight, 6 years of, you know, we've already talked about the press being very kind of pernicious. We've already, you know, we haven't kind of covered public opinion quite so much, but you were on a conveyor belt, and the stakes were always high, but they just kept getting higher. You kind of went through the entire court system in the UK as high as you could possibly go. You still didn't achieve your objective, and then the case had to go to Europe. So, you know, tell us a little bit about, you know, by the time it got to that level, you know, what sort of things were you facing, both kind of legally and otherwise? Because, you know, there's a story which I think has distinct relevance for our situation today, and some of the things that get dragged up in the press about how it was approached with you as well.
Well, if we talk first about the campaign, one of the problems with politics, particularly in England rather than Scotland, when it comes to LGBTQ+ matters, is that the debate has become toxic. And trans and non-binary is one hideous example of that. And I don't think that some of the organisations south of the border have handled that debate on our side with the sort of deftness that campaigners were working on age of consent or Section 28 or gays in the military in the 90s. We always wanted to debate. If there was a Kilroy programme, if there was a debate on Newsnight, we wanted to put up people not to fight and argue, but to put our point of view, to answer the questions, to talk to our opposition, and try and be the reasonable voice. And when we got a homophobe or a transphobe, it frankly was a gift, because all we had to do was to sit back, talk more quietly and more slowly, and be the voice of reason, and let them go off on their mad outburst. And then who would appear the reasonable one? So we wanted to engage, and I think that's a lesson that south of the border has been lost. It was not lost in Scotland, and I recognise how disappointing events of the last few weeks are. The SNP went out of its way to garner support from all political opinions and parties, and indeed did incredibly well to get it through with support of other parties in the Scottish Parliament. they really went to town on consulting and trying to bring people with them. But you were up against a nasty, nasty government in London, which has a real anti-trans agenda. And you were up against some right-wing media in England, and some Scottish owned as well, to a more limited extent, which has got it in and finds, and it's an easy attack on the trans and non-binary community. And that's where they've found the Achilles heel to go for what they've been wanting to do for a while.
Yeah. But I mean, the resonance that I was talking about or I was thinking of was, you know, one of the things that kind of like rears its ugly head in terms of the kind of fight for trans equality and trans rights is bathrooms.
Yes.
And you had your own experience of that right through and all the way up to the ECHR. So what happened in that instance?
Well, the Ministry of Defence and the Armed Forces, their principal arguments in front of the High Court and thereafter, they started off with the security angle that homosexuals are liable to be blackmailed or compromised, and therefore we need this policy. And the judges in the High Court said, you can't argue that. It's the very existence of this policy which renders people vulnerable to blackmail and attacks. So don't attempt to use your policy as justification for a consequence of that policy. So no, we're not accepting that argument. So we bowled that out on day one of the hearing. Their next thing was that it would not be conducive to unit, cohesiveness and morale, which, I mean, what does that mean? What exactly does that mean? So we had to, and the judges quite rightly asked for it. And actually it was, and there are some resonances here, that straight people would feel acutely uncomfortable if somebody from the LGBTQ community was in the shower with them and might be looking at them sexually. Oh, do dream on. But that was, you know, so yes, it's a resonance of an argument today, which is why I said earlier, this hideous way of making it all down to genitals. You know, so that's what we had to argue. And the reality was that for people serving in the armed forces, you find there was this enormous bond of trust. They knew that Duncan, Jennifer would take a bullet for them, and they would take a bullet for me, for Jennifer. So there were, you know, it was quite ridiculous. But in any argument about sexuality, if you just face a straight person with that, supposing you're in a shower and there was someone who's trans, someone who's gay, someone who's lesbian, how would you feel? And most people are going to go, oh, well, you know, what about so-and-so? They're gay. Oh, yeah, but I know them.
And didn't they actually bring people from, you know, your units into court? Do I remember that correctly? They actually brought people in as witnesses and asked them those questions?
So yes, there was as a consequence of a very narrow loss, I would say, in the High Court, the very first hearing, where the judgment began, Lawrence of Arabia would not be welcome in today's armed forces. And whatever the Ministry of Defence may say, the tide of history is against them. And our sympathy lies clearly with the applicants. But the law was simply not on our side in those days. We didn't have the Human Rights Act. And so the Ministry of Defence commissioned the Homosexual Policy Advisory Team, snappy title, HPAT for short, which was led by a psychologist and had a team of military officers. And they went and questioned and sent questionnaires and interviewed numerous military personnel. And it really was an exercise in trying to extract homophobia and transphobia out of people. And they took great delight in getting quotes like, a gay would be an accident waiting to happen. If I served with a gay, he'd likely get shot first, and things like that. And instead of doing what you and I would do, which is to say, should that person actually be wearing the Queen's uniform, let alone carrying a gun, they encouraged that sort of feedback and then held up this report in triumph and said, look, 99% of the people we asked in public in front of their commanding officers did not feel comfortable about serving with gays, like some sort of Putin type election, really.
But the kind, I'm so fascinated by this whole thing. But isn't the counter to that I think I read correctly that as you went to Europe, and I think it was, you know, quite soon before the European courts were due to kind of rule on the case, that wasn't there a poll in one of the British papers that said that 68% of the public were actually in favour of the ban being lifted?
Yeah, we started a very low threshold. We were in the low 30s. One of the Stonewall, in fact, you probably see him on Sky News quite often, Lord Hayward, who was not then a Lord. Rob Hayward was one of the Stonewall supporters, albeit a conservative one, gay man himself. And he is a man who reads public opinion. That's what he does for the Tories. And he was reading the tea leaves. And we started at this very low level of around about 35 to 38%. And gradually, as we campaigned and we put up sensible people to speak, and we gave real people who've been through the most awful police investigations to talk about their experience, that you could see public opinion change. And funnily enough, the big change when we suddenly realized that we were on a roll was in 1997, when 4 pilots had been followed by a team of 12 investigators each over a period of 3 months to prove that they were gay. They were dismissed. The cost of that investigation and the cost in wasted training was answered in the House of Commons at £15 million for that. And it was the Daily Mail who had a leading article criticising the policy as a waste of public money. And when the Daily Mail said that, we thought, perhaps we really have turned a corner. But of course, the reality for government is that, stand fast, the Scottish government, most governments are scared of taking a decision which might be controversial. And so the Conservatives, we were never going to win a change in the policy. People were hopeful with New Labour and Tony Blair because he was saying some nice things. But one must remember that Scottish Defence Secretary, thank you, John Reid. John Reid actually gave the most homophobic speech in the Edwina Currie's amendment debate in the 1996 review of the Armed Forces Act. So, you know, I always felt that there would be a sort of Clinton effect where Labour would back away from when it came down to it, when they came into power, because it is far easier for a government to point the finger at that nasty court in the European Court of Human Rights and say, well, it's their fault, not ours.
No, I mean, I mean, it's all just completely fascinating, because one of the things that I really want to kind of stress with that is that your discharge came in 94 and the case in Europe was heard in 99. So, you know, 5 years can feel like an incredibly long time when you're in the middle of that fight. But in retrospect, looking back and getting to that position of public opinion within that space of time is actually not very long at all. You know, so I think that there's, because I'm really keen to kind of talk about sort of some of the lessons that you learned from that case that are relevant today. And for me, that feels like one of it, that nothing, when you want these rights, when you want these rulings, they can never come more quickly enough. But I think that it's just really important to kind of recognize that it's like, we feel like we've been fighting forever, but if we get the tactics right and we can retain resilience, then, you know, actually what feels like forever might one day kind of go, we might be surprised how quick that feels.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we were it was a surprisingly quick legal action to get from High Court to Europe in just 5 years, effectively, is amazing. But there is something that needs to be done after that change. You still have to bring society with you, and you will still get people who are resisting that change, not least in a conservative organization like the Armed Forces. So after the year 2000, January 2000, when the law changed, they were still struggling. I know our communities in the Armed Forces, not sure whether it was safe to come out, not sure what the mood was, finding there was resistance among people. We'd worked in Rank Outsiders with the Ministry of Defence. You may have seen slanging matches, I shouldn't say that, but arguments in camera. You may have seen the sort of legal battle, but the reality is we were working with the Ministry of Defence, initially where they were receptive on the cruelty of police investigations and discharges. And by 1996, that system had changed. And was becoming much more, you still lost your job, but you weren't really duffed over before you left. And then we got onto the whole thing of what policies need to be in place, not just to protect our communities, but also to protect the rights of the straight community and the niceties for them as well. And so when January 2000 happened, they were ready to hit the ground running, and all those policies had been written in consultation with us. But the ongoing work needs to be done. And the first generation of people, the first few years were difficult for the armed forces as they got used to it. 2010, we're now into the second Gulf War. So everything stopped almost for that. And there was chaos, as we all know, with that war. And then in 2015, suddenly 5 years of very, very proactive chiefs of staff, the whole atmosphere really had changed. There were groups like Compass, the LGBTQ plus group in the armed forces. There were ex-service groups. The Royal British Legion were welcoming people in, having their own branch for our communities. So it was changing dramatically by then.
Yeah. And so I think that, in terms of tactics, some of the things that I've kind of taken away are really, prepare your arguments and be prepared to kind of like take them into public spaces, keep your cool, keep your calm when other people are kind of starting to come across as being a bit unhinged, for want of a better way of putting it. Just let them roll that out. Take a bit of a breath, take a bit of a step back. But then, you and I have spoken before about winning hearts and minds, which is absolutely crucial, and maybe something that we don't necessarily have time, unfortunately, to kind of unpick too much right now, because I do want to kind of try and wrap us up so that we've got time for kind of questions. But I think that, those are some of the tactics. For you as an individual that was in the middle of that for, 5-6 years, what did you do to kind of keep your resilience up?
I think when you're in the middle of a battle like that, you're living on adrenaline. And I will be honest that by the end of that, when the ban was lifted, I was ready to take time away from the front line.
Yeah.
And with what Arlene has said in New Zealand, what Nicola has said in the last couple of weeks, I really relate to that sort of running out of steam feeling, and the knowledge, that woman has been under serious attack by Westminster, and particularly. So I have no doubt that she is quite exhausted after 8 years of really giving and being treated quite badly by the rest of this country. So, you just, you do run out of steam, and I needed time out. I needed time away from that drug that is the media. I needed time where I could still do things for our communities, but not actually having to be in front of a camera, not being so public about it. So I went almost sort of underground a bit, working with groups.
And that's really reaped rewards for the LGBTIQA plus community in Brighton by how much you've been able to kind of do now that you're using your experience and bringing that to bear for the community, and you're very much part of that community and hugely respected. So it's kind of paid off for you that you took that time out.
Yeah, and for me, it was really great learning time, because I'd never met anybody who was trans until really sort of towards the end of the campaign, even though we've been working, and talking to the trans community. I'd never really spoken to young people or met an intersex person, for example. So it for me, it was a real learning time as well. And for the Ledwood Centre, I was determined that we were going to be as inclusive and diverse as possible, and we would nail our colours to the mast. So our project manager for the build, and we're talking about 7,000 square feet of building.
This is for the Ledwood Centre,
yeah. Ledwood Centre. It was in her first job after 35 years in the building industry as a project manager, in her first job as Claire, feeling safe to be Claire. And the person in charge of our demolitions, who actually was an army demolitions expert, also did their work for us in their real gender. And I wanted to send those very strong signals that here is a safe space. And when the trans community in particular, who is so vulnerable, when they gave back to us by saying, Trans Day of Remembrance, can we have it at the Ledwood Centre? Sure, would you like Jubilee Square as well for that? To me was emotional, because we've won their trust. They know that they're safe with us. And that's all that we wanted. And once they feel safe with us, the rest of our communities are going to learn from them.
Cool. So listen, I'm going to ask one last question, which is a bit of a kind of like shoe-in, but there's a lot of understandable and correct concern about some of what's been said in the leadership debate. And I've heard it expressed from people that I have enormous respect for, that should Kate Forbes be successful in her bid to become leader of the SNP and therefore our First Minister, that they will walk away from the party. And I, in my heart, I completely understand that. Is there anything that you would say to them about that feeling, and not whether that sense is right or wrong, but just kind of like, what's important about what we take from our situation at the moment?
I think it's important you remain within and argue your case, and do it quietly and gently. It's almost being sold at the moment as if the queer community is the upper hand, and now it's the religious people are being oppressed, which is a great narrative for the right, frankly. The reality is that we are very much, I believe, for other people's freedoms of expression, freedoms of faith. That is certainly what I see of the SNP as a group. And we would not wish to oppress anyone's beliefs. Please respect that as well with us. Don't try and repress us in what we do. That's the sort of conversation. We want you to have your relationship, your personal relationship with God is yours, and we respect that. But please respect the way that we live our lives. And in those are sort of ongoing conversations all the time. I think it's now a minority within the SNP, and it's interesting the reaction. I don't think she's going to make it over the line. Yeah,
it's interesting. So listen, Duncan, thank you so much for all of that. There are a few questions that have kind of come in from other people in the room. So the first one, we may want to take this offline, because I have a sense that there are elements of it that we might not want to kind of talk too much in detail about. But the first question, extraordinary. Okay, so thank you. I hope that answered the question. The next question we've got, somebody's asking about, I haven't heard of this. So in Canada, there's a fund called the LGBT Purge Fund that was created to compensate LGBTQ plus people who were purged from public service roles and do public education programs about the purge. What do you think the chances of doing something like that here are?
It's happening.
Okay.
There is an inquiry being led by a former Master of the Rolls, so Lord Chief Justice of Appeal, Terence Etherton. Terence is himself gay, and he is leading an informal inquiry, which has been implemented by the government of all things, into the whole issue of the LGBT victims of the policy. And he's due to report at the end of May. He's been taking evidence for 7 months now. He has heard from many, many people. He has very strong views of the evidence he's heard. He is throwing away the rule book when it comes to legal statute of limitations. And basically anyone from 1967 to the year 2000, he, I am sure, is going to recommend receives compensation and also support for ongoing medical or mental health issues, as well as support with housing or anything else. His report, and I've been drafting his first 3 paragraphs for him, is going to be very comprehensive. And I think, you know, the only thing that we've got to watch is that the Conservative government doesn't try and bury it as it does with any other report recently that's unfavourable. But that's what's happening.
Right, and that's for the military, or is it?
That is for the military, because between 1967 and January 2000, over 20,000 people lost their jobs in this way. Now, many of them are not alive anymore, an aging community, obviously, but there are still people who did not fit that very narrow timescale of any compensation. And even those entitled to that compensation in the time window were screwed into the ground by a huge department of solicitors who wore them down financially and made life difficult. So people who'd lost whole careers, who would normally have received 120, 150,000 pounds compensation, walked away with 8,000 pounds on a solicitor's bill.
Extraordinary, and it's so extraordinary to kind of really think that, you know, the big battle was won 23 years ago in some respects, but actually what you were saying earlier about how it's taking time for the culture and for the consequence to really kind of be resolved is also really interesting. One other question that we've kind of had through chat, and this is actually something that's really important. I intended to kind of talk to you about it. Your case, ultimately Europe, age of consent, Europe, you know, even elements around kind of like GRA happened because of Europe. We obviously don't have access to that now, or certainly not, you know, in the same sort of vein that we did then. So what do you think is kind of our tactic now, given that the legal kind of recourse has changed?
So the cases you've mentioned are European Court of Human Rights, which is a convention matter, not an EU matter. So, you know, there is a danger, although I think the Lords are going to fight it, and there isn't much life left in this government in London. I think we'll probably just about retain the ECHR, which is important because, you know, that's given those rights. The trans question in the armed forces was settled by the European Court of Justice, so that is an EU court, under first sex discrimination law, which is EU law, and actually a get-out clause. The Ministry of Defence took the easy option and said, oh, we're going to treat it as a medical matter, not a discrimination matter. And so they walked away. It was, funnily enough, would you believe, in 1999 that trans people were allowed to serve in the military. So that was an early.
So they got in before
there
you
first.
did.
Yeah, that was an early victory. But it was purely because we're only talking about 1 or 2 people, and you know it's a medical issue.
So we're hoping for kind of staying
The
with
ECHR is
ECHR
fine.
as access,
Mm,
and a bridge to be crossed if it
yeah,
doesn't happen.
but I mean, you've raised a whole much wider question about the rights of working people and
Absolutely.
the tearing up of those rights, which uh, Rees-Mogg started, and the Westminster government would be dearly love to do. So, you know, we really need to work hard. It's
So
taking years to get
that's
to this.
absolutely crucial in you know, hand in hand with any of these campaigns and legislative flights now.
Yeah,
Which is a really good point. We can't let that go.
it's a very strong point for people who would naturally support you, including those in the Labour Party, that this, what you are doing, is very important because it is a matter of EU law for some of our community, which would be torn up and thrown away by a Westminster government if they had their
Yeah,
way. And so, you know, let's unite on this because we're all here for workers' rights. And attacking
fantastic.
one group of workers is the beginning of the end for others.
And actually, when you and I were talking at the weekend, it's kind of like, you know, I was really reminded of kind of how instrumental, you know, LGSM, lesbian and gay support the minors, were in actually changing the mind of the unions, which is extraordinary. But okay, I've had, and I thought that was going to be the last one that had come through on chat, but we've got one more. So, and I think that this is a great one that could potentially move us towards wrapping up. But it's very much in the realm of kind of hearts and minds that you and I have talked about. So, as someone who's led such successful campaigns, what's your recommendation for winning allies and how straight people can be good allies to the movement for LGBTQ plus people? Oh, equality, sorry.
Yeah. So, a good ally, I think for a start, let us show the way by being allies to other disadvantaged communities. One of the organizations that I co-founded was the Equality Alliance back in the early 90s, which was an umbrella organization, not just for our communities, but for people of color, for disabled groups, so we could come together and share and not have to reinvent the wheels as small organizations every time we had a campaign, every time we needed a fundraising idea. That's what it was all about, trying to support one another. A good ally, let's start with allies, is just simply holding your hand up and say, hey, that's neither fair, it's wrong, and standing with you. Take it one step further, and we need straight ambassadors as well, who are going to be a bit more upfront, perhaps campaigning. And we've got a few of them.
Yeah.
You can see a few of them. But, you know, at the end of the day, we'd have got nowhere as a tiny group of people trying to change, ultimately, the UK and the rest of Europe and then the United States. We would have got nowhere without our allies. And we must remember that, and we've got a lot of them around, and let's nurture them as well and make sure they
Indeed.
realize how valued they are.
Erin, can I've just heard an alarm go off somewhere in my house. It's like, how inconvenient is that? Can I maybe just get you to kind of hold the space for a little bit and see if there's any questions from other people in the room? And I'll be 30 seconds or so and I'll be right back.
Oh, yeah,
Sorry.
absolutely. Yeah, that's always the fun thing of doing things on Zoom, is that we end up with all sorts of little house emergencies when we're trying to run an event. But that being said, I think that was actually a great question to wrap up on, in terms of a lot of what this has been about has been sort of how to organize to win, how we can learn lessons from your experience and carry them forward into what's happening now. And I'm just really thankful that you've been here tonight to speak with us. And I'm looking forward to getting this up onto the YouTube so that more people can benefit from what you've shared with us. Yeah, when we organized this event, we weren't expecting to be going into a leadership selection that was going to somehow end up being fought almost entirely on LGBTQ issues, it seems, at least so far. So it's really helpful to have the reminder from you of having won an unpopular fight, that even when things look bleak, we just need to keep going.
I think take a deep breath, try and calm your minds, and realize that what ultimately you want to achieve for Scotland and what you have already achieved for your communities is vitally important. And the only reason that you are getting this flack now is because you are being successful. So take heart. People don't shout and scream and make a fuss if you're nobodies who are achieving nothing. They're realizing that their backs are against the wall in this fight. And that's why you're under attack. Hold fast, you'll make it.
Thank you. So we've had no further questions from the floor. So if you want to wrap it up, Ewan.
Brilliant. Thanks. Thanks for taking that over. As
I'll
you
get told
say,
off. I get told off if my friend John Nicholson doesn't get his oar in here. He sends his best wishes to you all.
oh, brilliant. And I'm really aware from kind of social media earlier today, Duncan, that there were other people that were interested to, I'm not sure if they were party members or not, but we'll be kind of doing something with this recording. So we'll try and make it available to them as well. So I mean, it really just leaves me to say thank you so much. I know a lot more of your story. I know that there is much more ground that we could have covered. Just because you have been such a busy body over the years, and kind of like got yourself into every single corner that you can possibly get yourself into. But I'm so grateful for you just taking the time to kind of spend an hour and a half with us tonight. I've valued it enormously, and hopefully other people will have kind of taken good stead from it to kind of keep the fight going. So thank you so much.